Hello there, listening audience. Welcome to another exciting edition of Unlock the Door Radio here on UCY TV Productions. This is Michael Cross here, and tonight we have a really special guest. I ran across one of his interviews with a representative of Scientific American. He's a psychology professor from the University of New Mexico, and he recently authored a book called The Psychopathic Whisperer, which I believe has an award of being the #1 psychology book of the year. Is that right, Kent?
Well, first, thanks very much for having me. And I think that the book is selling pretty well in different areas, in different parts of the world. It's been getting different types of accolades. So I would hopefully someday it'll be ranked in the top of psychology books, but certainly I've received a lot of positive feedback.
Excellent. I want to get into what like the difference is between, for instance, such things as sociopaths and psychopaths, which you elaborated on in the interview I listened to. But first, I want to just ask, what got you involved in this study of psychopaths in the first place?
So I actually grew up just down the street from a serial killer known as Ted Bundy. And when I was growing up, my father was a newspaper writer. And he was always writing stories about this kid who grew up down the street, and we were all just mystified by how, from our sleepy little suburb, somebody could end up doing such, terrible things. And when I was in college, at university, I decided to try to make a career out of studying, things that I just found to be, really absolutely fascinating. And the two things that came together were neuroscience and, psychopathy. And so I've just been fortunate to be able to make a career out of studying how do individuals, with psychopathic traits, how do they develop, how do they get that way, and how might we develop ways of potentially treating and, and better understanding them. And so it's just become, it's from basically just a very early curiosity, and I've just been fortunate to be able to make a career out of it.
Sounds interesting. We'll get into some of your experiences with actual interviews with psychopaths in a moment, but what I want to ask is this. Does Hollywood portray psychopaths correctly, or is there something a lot deeper than the TV shows like, Hannibal and shows like that?
I mean, most of the Hollywood, portrayals of psychopaths, they typically, or people with these traits, I guess, is they usually try to relate it to some sort of early childhood experience or trauma or event. So like Dexter and witnessing, really bad traumatic things and people dying and blood everywhere, led Dexter to, potentially decide to, kill people who do bad things. And then, Hannibal was similar, basically the experience of, starvation and, having to save his sister, etc. That's the Hollywood appears to try to have some sort of a causal link between, the environmental triggers and, this personality disorder we study that we call psychopathy. So, but in real life, psychopaths actually, there's no known triggers like that are actually commonly, that you would find in the ones that we work with in prisons every day. They often, have developed for whatever reasons just very differently than their siblings and peers and other family members, and they end up, leading a life that ends up in a lot of problems and trouble, and they don't stick to normal, relationships. They don't stick to the same, job or occupation. They usually don't complete their normal educational, experiences that most of us get through high school, etc. And they just lead kind of a nomadic existence that often ends up in getting in trouble with law, sometimes with violence, and that's what we see. And so, unfortunately, we just don't see that there's some single trigger that is related to the development of a lot of individuals that we study that we could pinpoint as the cause. And so that's how Hollywood likes to portray them. Hollywood also, likes to portray them as extremely violent, even gratuitously violent. And whereas it's true that violence and psychopathy are linked, most violence is probably not committed by psychopaths, and but psychopaths do, especially when the ones that end up in prisons. There is a propensity to see them with violence, but psychopathy is far more banal than the way that Hollywood tends to portray it.
Okay, I just want to go back to Dexter for a moment because I had a student that did a term paper where he tried to show that Dexter was more Asperger with post-traumatic stress disorder versus a true psychopath. Would you kind of agree with that, or?
I think, no. So Dexter, I mean, we actually obviously have done similar, any undergraduate class wants to try to rate Dexter on psychopathy and understand the motivations. But Dexter's, he, in terms of a PTSD diagnosis, he does not appear to suffer from a lot of anxiety or distress associated with his background. That doesn't mean that he hasn't just internalized it, but there's no real anxiety symptoms. There's no real ability to maintain a job, ability to maintain, even some relationships, etc. So Dexter is kind of a mix, but I don't think, at least in the seasons that I've watched, that Dexter would fit criterion for a post-traumatic stress disorder. However, in Asperger's, Dexter doesn't seem to me to be having any real social impairments or other types of, oddities that would be related to a condition like that. As it relates to psychopathy, Dexter scores well above the average male, but he doesn't necessarily score in the clinical range that we would typically associate with being psychopathic. So, for example, why doesn't he score really super high? And, one of the reasons is that he's able to keep a job. He's able to maintain stability in that area of his life. He's been able to, maintain relationships, to have a marriage. He appears to show very solid, if you will, affective and emotional connections to not only the children of his first wife, but also his sister. He takes great care of his sister. He's very close to her. He has strong emotional connections to her, and also his parents, or the ones that raised him anyway. He had a very strong connection to them, and he remembers them fondly, et cetera, et cetera. So those types of connections are not found in people who score high on all of the traits. So Dexter is in the moderately high range for normal, of course, but he's not someone who necessarily scores in the true clinical, sense of the condition. So he has quite a bit more ability to control different domains of his life than we would typically see. Even though they portray him sometimes having quite chaotic and almost getting caught and, doing very bad things, he's kind of a unique, television character in this regard because he shows such stability in some areas and relatively a little bit of instability or risk-taking in other areas that most of us might think would, we would never do, of course. But so he's a bit of a mix, but he doesn't have all of the traits in all domains of his life for the vast majority of his life, and that's what it takes to score really high. Okay.
Speaking of scoring, could you just kind of review the criteria that would make someone a psychopath? I mean, I know, about the hair, checklist, so forth.
Yeah.
But what are some of the things that you look for that would kind of scream out, this person might be a psychopath if they score high in those areas?
Sure. Well, there's a long history of assessing these traits from the earliest days of psychiatry. So dating back into the early 1800s, clinicians have recognized that individuals with these traits are often end up, in institutionalized settings, end up, getting in trouble over and over again, but are otherwise, intact intelligence, and it just really mystifies people why they keep misbehaving and never following through with anything and end up being usually getting in some form of trouble and have just no stability in their affective and interpersonal relationships. And, through the years, we've slowly identified and created instruments that help to characterize those symptoms and allows then, clinicians to accurately kind of assess them in such a way that it has some useful predictive utility in a forensic environment or in other types of work and related environments. So the symptoms are things like lack of empathy, guilt, and remorse, and inability to appreciate, understand, or empathize with others. They don't follow with any life plan. They typically don't make long plans at all, but they often, even if they do, they never follow through with them. They are glib and jovial and verbally talkative, but they're often, make up stories. My favorite term is mendacity. It's a term that just means they make up stories for no good reason, and they can be easily fact-checked, and then you would score them high on the other items like lying and pathological lying and conning manipulative behaviors. They have very low frustration tolerance, and so they're often hot-headed. They often, will get in verbal escalated arguments, over trivial things, surprising people. They can often be associated with, punching things or people when they get angry. The behaviors that we're discussing here are present from a very early age, so you usually see, as early as age 5, 6, 7, parents are talking about how their child was different, how they were, problematic. They didn't participate in team sports. They didn't have a lot of close friends. They were very nomadic. They did things by themselves. They even started to do early antisocial behavior like burglarizing homes before, the age of 12, often by themselves. They also persist through severe adolescent delinquency, so they will commit a lot more antisocial behavior in adolescence than is typical, mostly in terms of its severity. And then they continue as adults to participate in a wide variety of different antisocial behaviors. There's a lot of different types of drugs often used and abused. There's a wide variety of different types of jobs. Sometimes they get a job because they're good and they're talkative, and then they just quit and leave, even though people were like they were doing just fine, at this type of a job. And general instability in emotional relationships. So, don't really know where mom and dad are, don't really, develop anything more than a 2-3 month relationship with women. They move on very quickly. They're very promiscuous. And so they're willing to engage in a wide variety of different types of sexual, activities. They really treat, sex as equivalent to love. And so if you ask them about, do they love anybody, they usually just equate it to the best physical sex they've had. And so there's a real disconnection between those central emotional behaviors and, what most of us generally take for granted, and psychopathy. And so it's a constellation of about 20 traits. And again, because we're assessing a trait, we really do have to be clear that it has to be present in many domains of their life. It can't just be in one domain, because that does not score high then when you're measuring a trait. So you have to be looking at how these behaviors relate to their school relationships, their work relationships, their family relationships, their romantic relationships. And when you see evidence for these traits in all of those domains, well, then it's a trait, and also then it's usually associated with some form of impairment. And in order to be a personality disorder, you have to have impairment in those different domains. And that's what we find when people score really high on these traits, is that they don't achieve anything that most of us would call normal. And so that's how you define the condition.
Now, this goes along a scale, right? I mean, a person could take the test and they could get a 5 out of 40. I've noticed 40 seems to be the scale that everyone uses. They could get a 10, they could get a 20, 30, 40. Are the people that Robert Hare, when he talks about corporate psychopaths and political psychopaths, are these people that score maybe in the 20 range, but not up into the 40s, or what have you found?
Well, I think that it is a dimensional scale in the sense that it ranges from 0 to 40, 40 being a perfect score. The average male will score about 4 out of 40. The average incarcerated individual scores about 20, out of 40. And then when we get people who score over 30, but often, 34, 35, 36, then those are the ones that we really have identified as someone who really has the personality disorder. But even in people who score, 15, 16, you would know that they are different than someone who scores just around 4. But it's not necessarily going to lead to impairments in all those different domains of their life. So they're just going to have likely some problems in a few domains, maybe not stable interpersonal relationships, for example. And even though they might not be clinically a psychopath from the scales that we use in the forensic environment, they still might not be a good boss to have, or a good business partner to have, or they might not be, someone that you really want to date. And they're not going to be likely, those traits are just not conducive to long stability in all those different domains. And so I think there is a continuum of them, but I think we do often toss around the term psychopath a little loosely, and so sometimes, my preference has always been to define it very rigorously, and not to throw the term around loosely, because it has a pejorative sense to it as well. And so you don't want to start labeling, every politician or corporate person who does something, to lay off a lot of people or has to make a tough business decision as a psychopath, because in actuality, the likelihood is they're very much probably not likely to be scoring very high. So those are that's this kind of landscape, that we currently work in. And just because someone, has a tough-minded, business-minded, corporate-minded, profit-minded, perspective on things, that doesn't going to make them, score high. If they also, frankly, have multiple wives and they have, they fake their credentials for their education. Well, now you're talking about one of my guys, who's actually scoring a lot higher, that has somehow maintained himself from getting in prison, or getting caught. And, at some point they're likely to be figured out. But that's the type of, of person that, we just want to try to avoid getting into those types of positions. So that's in a nutshell.
So a 5 is like an average person, nice person. A 20 could be potentially a dangerous person, and a 30 and above is really bad news. Exactly.
I mean, like I said, I've had some good colleagues who've said, I don't even want to date a 20. I don't even want to date a 15, because, they're just not likely to be stable and have, good, healthy relationship with them. So I think you really do have to, think about the clinical levels of the traits. I mean, some countries use a lower cutoff than we do in North America, for, treatment, for, parole decisions, and in other, aspects, because they recognize that, you don't need to wait for someone to get to such high clinical levels for there to be, problems. You still need to try to manage, them if they're scoring even in the just above average range. So that's that's kind of a nutshell. So, for example, if you were developing a test to help people, recognize, are these the traits that you're assessing, in someone that you might want to date? I think if you look at Chapter 2 in my book, or Chapter 3, it should give you a really good understanding of the types of things that you should be red flags when you're thinking about, if you're thinking about trying to find someone you want to have a long-term relationship with. So, and the answer to your question about dangerousness, yes, the literature generally supports a linear argument. That is, that the higher you score on these traits, the more likely you're to commit a violent crime, if you're released from prison. I don't think we have good data yet on just, if I assessed, 1,000 men in the community, would I be able to predict violence? Probably not. But within a high risk population, the scale gets a lot of, it's very predictive.
Now, you said men, but women have there's psychopathic women as well, correct?
Correct. In female samples, women tend to have about the rate of psychopathy about 1/10, that of males. So if the rate of psychopathy in men is 1 in 150, the rate of psychopathy in women is about 1 in 1,050. So it's really a much lower base rate. So, in the United States, I always get asked this question, is crime genetic? And my answer is always yes. I mean, 90% of crime is committed by people with this abnormality. 99% of people on death row have this abnormality, genetic abnormality. It's called the Y chromosome. And so, males are much more likely to be aggressive, to have these types of personality traits than are women. But even within the minority female, prison population, only about 10%, of prisoners are female. And even within that population, the rate of psychopathy is even, lower, than we see in males. So it's very, very, very rare to find a female who scores in the clinical range.
Okay, but again, in the 20s and 25 and so forth, they'd still have some of the traits, but not be the danger. Seems like that'd be even more dangerous. These are the people that know empathy, but just ignore it. I mean, at least that's what I've thought, but.
A little bit. I mean, I think that they might, they just are generally, they might have a little bit of empathy for family but they don't have empathy in any other domain. And so they definitely would be on the range of, again, it's probably best not to, engage in business dealings with them, et cetera, et cetera. So, Yeah.
Okay, interesting. Now, you bring up a genetic component, so I'm just going to basically ask, what is the difference between a psychopath and a sociopath? I mean, is there one?
Well, those two terms were both, developed to assess the same traits. And so sociopathic personality disturbance and DSM-3, which was in the 50s, 60s, that was the same types of symptoms that were used to be associated with the word psychopathy. So psychopathy was a term that was used much earlier, to identify these traits. And then in the behaviorist era of psychology, the term sociopath was coined, which is that social forces have indicated that you're going to have these problems. So you were a blank slate when you were born, and the only thing that influenced you was the social processes that cumulatively lead you to have these problems as an adult. So kind of like Dexter. If Dexter, if it would be a sociopathic type of personality disturbance because of the way that they portrayed him, as that it was based on his early childhood experiences was the sole determining factor. But what if Dexter had a genetic predisposition to be more psychopathic than somebody else? Well, then the social forces might have interacted with those genetic or biological forces to have led him to do what he's doing, or the way that his personality has been formed, as an adult. And so basically, in a nutshell, sociopathic connotates the same symptoms, but that social forces made you, whereas psychopathic is agnostic to etiology and is equally plausible that both social and biological forces, which of course are usually the path, interacted to lead to the personality disturbances we see in individuals who score high on these traits as adults. So that's the terminology. Most people, we use them kind of interchangeably, but we don't use the word sociopathic in academic parlance anymore. It's just, it has that connotation that there's really no empirical support that things come from, just social forces.
Okay, so you're kind of saying then that, let's say, I mean, you can only speculate on this, but let's say you could have got Ted Bundy when he was a baby and raised him in a normal household. I mean, Ted Bundy tried to blame everything, it seems, for his condition. He tried to say that pornography made him go out and kill and stuff like that, which, I'm sure he was trying to find someone to blame. But if you'd have taken Bundy as a baby and raised him in a normal, functioning family, unlike the one he was raised in, could he have turned into, instead of, he was a law student, could he have wound up becoming a successful lawyer?
So it's obviously a complicated, question to answer, but, I don't know that his family environment was that chaotic. I mean, he was raised by, I believe it was an older sister who said that was his mother, and that caused him some distress when he found that out. But, in the totality of things that can happen to someone as a child, I would not have characterized his childhood as being nearly as traumatic as many of the other people we meet in prison today, who come from just terrible backgrounds. So it's hard to say that anything, might have steered him off of the course that he, went into. But certainly he had the intellectual, the acumen to achieve a University of Washington degree in psychology, to actually, get a little bit through law school before he started to get caught for, the kidnappings and other things that he was doing. So I would love to be able to say that, yes, had he had different parents, he might not have ever done such a thing, but unfortunately we just don't, we don't know. Serial killers in particular do come from all walks of life, and, if we know anything about serial killers, it's just that we don't have a great way to try to predict how they would, how they develop and how they get that way. And certainly serial killing is a very, very, very unique, pathology, if you will, especially the type that we're talking about with sexual-based, motivations behind it. So, I've interviewed many serial killers and have yet to identify, any environmental triggers that were likely to, lead to that development. And so, I just don't think we could say that, unfortunately.
Okay, but you believe that there is a genetic component that then depending on the way the environment is, can cause a person to go one way or another when it comes to acceptable values in the society?
Again, I think you could take the most difficult child who's maybe already even gotten convicted of felonies as an adolescent, and I think you can teach them to be more pro-social, and you can teach them to have better impulse control, and you can, what we refer to as cognitive control in psychology, and you can help them not commit, future antisocial behavior. In fact, there's treatment programs we work with who have shown, amazingly well that you can actually reduce the violent crime that is so commonly observed in kids from, who get released from maximum security prisons out into the street. And so these types of treatment programs are becoming much more popular because they do show, good efficacy for reducing violence. So, and the kids that we're talking about are extremely high-risk kids from, very troubling backgrounds, but also, that they can be taught to manage their antisocial behavior. And that I think is a very, very, very salient point. Now, could parents have done that? To come back to your point about Ted Bundy, could parents have tried to manage his behavior better and use different principles? I have to concede that probably it might have been possible to help him from committing the types of crimes that he did, finding some sort of a different way of managing him. So it's possible. I just think it might be difficult.
Okay. All right. Well, you mentioned that you've interviewed some people who've been involved in some pretty nasty crimes. What kind of sense did you get when I've sat in courtrooms before where there's been like a person on trial for murder, and sometimes you can get they'll look your direction and it's like a blankness about them. Do you see that, or is it just the way that we perceive things of individuals?
Yeah, so actually, the blankness, the failure to show normal affect, the so-called, almost some people refer to them as reptilian eyes, where there really is a lack of affect, there's a lack of depth. It's very palpable when you're meeting people with these traits. And so that's very, true. In most psychopaths we meet, that you definitely feel that they have different facial expressions, they have different affective, expressions in terms of both verbally as well as, their facial, the way they present to you. They're definitely different. And the eyes are a very common indicator that something is just amiss. It's difficult to nail down or come up with a way of describing it, but essentially the eyes just truly feel like they're flat and they don't have any emotion behind them. And that type of almost automatic kind of eye movements, rather than any kind of a suggestive, affective processes, that really does differentiate those with high scoring traits than low. Unfortunately, I haven't tried to empirically test this yet, but I certainly would think that the eye movements are going to be different between psychopathic and non-psychopathic individuals.
So, this is amazing. You're looking at scans of murderers, of schizophrenics, normal brain scans, PET scans, and your own brain scan, and you discover that in your own brain, it is the same kind of brain as a psychopath.
Yeah, that was like the worst case, because all those areas of the brain that they had decided, by looking at these, that were involved in, the psychopathic personality, I had all of them, and it was completely turned off. And it had to do with emotional regulation.
So you can actually see in a brain scan if somebody's a psychopath?
Not really. What you can see are changes that are consistent with traits. So I can look at different brain scans and say that person's got a language problem, that person's got a problem with their visual system or sense of space. So you can see traits.
And the traits of a psychopath that are clear to you, that you think you have, are what?
Well, it's a very poor sense of morality, first of all. And like for me and for people who are psychopaths, they can have a sense of ethics, the rules of behavior. But actually the deep morality, what we consider morality, is not there.
I'm convinced it's there's a lot more people out there who are psychopaths than we realize, and particularly successful people, accomplished people, people on TV, people in the political sphere. I'm convinced there are tons of psychopaths.
Oh, yeah, and if you look at, there was just a study done, a scientific study of all our presidents, and all the biographers answered all these questions about them, and it was on a scale of psychopathy. And on the scale of psychopathy, in sort of the one part of psychopathy, not the criminality part, but the other part, which is a big part of psychopathy, the ones who scored very high were like Theodore Roosevelt, JFK, FDR, Bill Clinton, very high. The ones had no psychopathy at all in this were people like Jimmy Carter, Gerald Ford. And when you look at the association of those psychopathic traits with leadership, it's like we want these people, right? Because they do things that are, they take chances, they lie at the right time. FDR was lying all the time, but he saved us, so it was okay. So if you look at people that we choose to be leaders, I think a lot of them have these traits, and they're part of leadership skills.
I also think what it takes to propel somebody into the public sphere, propel somebody to success, I mean, they are not normal impulses, I think, and I think a lot of them are psychopathic impulses.
If you have that grand vision, because psychopaths will have a grand vision, not all of them. Some are just lousy rats, but people have that grandiose narcissistic need, and they've got something to prove, and they've got something, they say, I'm going to save the world. That's part of it. It doesn't make you psychopathic, but it's one of the traits that fits into this puzzle of psychopathy.
It's really fascinating. Thank you so much for talking about it.
So, you think perhaps the people that score really high are not going to be able to be at there's going to be something that's going to kind of warn you. If you say the reptilian eyes, it's going to warn you, and they're not maybe as skilled at manipulating people as, for instance, someone who might, score 30 and still kind of understand the victim better.
So I think a lot of psychopathic crime or crimes committed by individuals who are psychopathic is, it's just, it doesn't necessarily have as much of a planned, motivations behind it. There's sometimes just a little bit more, opportunistic and, see something that they could just pick or steal or do something, and then they just have no inhibitions about doing it, so they do it. They're just, to be honest with you, there's just so many different types of ways in which psychopaths can be manipulative. Sometimes they don't even know they're being manipulative, and people later perceive or feel jilted, and they say they felt manipulated, but the psychopath doesn't feel or doesn't tell or it doesn't appear that they actually tried to, be manipulative, and whether or not this be in a relationship or in a business dealing or something else. But psychopaths are also capable of doing, schemes and cons, and they do those types of things. They don't have any inhibitions that most of us normally do about, committing those types of crimes. And so sometimes some of the crimes are more well thought out. Now, people think like, well, if they're well thought out, then, why do they get caught? And what we've published on recently is just that psychopaths engage in so much crime, it's only a matter of time before they actually do get caught. But they might do 100 burglaries, or they might do 100 credit card scams before they get caught for one. And so they're doing them with such frequency and such, repetition that to them, there's no downside to really, doing them. They're so rarely punished for or caught for what they've done that there's really just no sense of risk when they go do it. I hope that's making sense. But you do get somebody who, even if they score in the 20s or 25, they may have been, willing to engage in a wide variety of illegal activity related to cons and schemes and other types of things. So certainly that happens as well. It's just that when it happens with people who score very high, it's pretty often impressive just how many times and how many, like I interviewed a guy who for years was a telephone repairman, and so he would come to your house, and his scam was that he would ask you, if you wanted free long distance, and people would say sure, and he'd say, well, give me, $500 and I'll give you long distance free for life. And so he would do this. He did this for like 15 years, he was just giving away and making, an unbelievably, fleecing the phone company, of course, but, he was able to do this on just entire apartment complexes. And everybody would pay him for their free long distance for life. And then he would take off and, go someplace else and do the same thing. And I can't even imagine how many people he actually did that for, but it's a large number of people. And that wasn't the only thing. I mean, he would do lots of different types of schemes and scams and things like that. Like, he would show up at an apartment complex if he didn't have anything else to do that day and just disconnect the phone stuff, and everybody would call and he would say, well, hey, I'm not on the clock today, but I'll fix it for you for $100. And he would just go back downstairs and flip a switch, and then, people would give him $100. So he did stuff like that just all the time. And I mean, to the point where it was just normal for him.
Okay, so essentially, you think it's because, I mean, it sounds like these people are so gullible, but it seems that most people.
No, I want to say that. So sorry, you raised this other thing here. So sorry to interrupt, but most people generally walk into a new experience or meeting somebody new with the sense that, well, you should generally trust people and should generally, try not to be, jaded or anything. And I think the psychopathic personality, just takes advantage of that I don't want to call it gullibility because it's not, but just takes advantage of that kind of general frame set that someone approaches a new relationship with. And, the next thing you know, you're just like, wow, I can't believe that just happened to me. And someone was willing to do that. Like, that's just not, it's just not right. But for the psychopath, that's just their way they interact with everybody. There's no sense of trust. There's no cooperation. There's no social, etiquette that they're worried about offending or doing anything. So that's just, I think, part of it. And what happens too is just that psychopaths do this and they don't even realize it sometimes that that's what they've done. And they're just, they're very, very, very socially disinhibited. And so they just ask for things and people often just give them things, and then you're left with like, wow, that probably wasn't a good deal for me. But, that's a lot of what we see is just that they're so freely socially disinhibited. They're just completely willing to, try anything when it comes to those types of experiences.
Well, speaking of that, I veer off a little bit from crime to the idea that it seems like those kinds of traits where an individual who does not conform to the norms, stands out, per se, is actually going to be seen as fairly attractive to many people because they're different. Do you find that tends to be a factor that, I'm just going to use this in the male-female type situation where if a male is showing these kinds of, I don't care what the world thinks about anything, then you will see a certain attraction to that.
So, yes. So I think that the psychopath, when they first present to people, is novel, engaging, talkative, entertaining, tells great stories, is quick-witted, and without any background information about that person or whatever, they can be very engaging and fun and novel and everything. But then, you quickly learn that, that they don't pay their bills back, they don't pay their back, they use resources wherever they go, and then they're not cooperative in that kind of a setting. But from some of the evolutionary perspectives on this condition, are that, that is the type of, it's a very engaging, socially driven, drive out and go someplace else to meet other people, kind of, move from the stagnant to population based to someplace new, and that these traits are designed to help facilitate, that lack of attachments to where you're from, and to go out and literally explore, and you're very good at talking and meeting and engaging in other people because there's safety in doing all those types of things. So I know that this is a, kind of a post hoc explanation for, some of the traits, but certainly psychopaths are extremely socially charming initially and fun, engaging conversationalists, and they really are clinically very fascinating, frankly.
Okay, so that is why maybe from an evolutionary psychology standpoint, that would be why the trait seems to continue then.
Correct. Yeah, I mean, they're very promiscuous. And the evolutionary argument is that for a small percentage of men, and to some extent even smaller percentage, but of women, they move around, they're nomadic, and they move into an area. They basically reproduce as frequently, and they don't develop attachment. So they might reproduce or try to reproduce with 20 different women, and then they never stick around, so they just move on. And for a small percentage of the population to adopt that kind of a strategy, there are models that have shown that it's an effective way of throwing out a lot of your genetics into the population, and then with the hope that 1 or 2 or 3 will survive and continue to your own genetic material, propagate your own genetic material, that's effective. But it breaks down when a large number of people try to do that, because then the social group in which is trying to raise a single parent child is not sufficient to support that child raising up to reproductive age. And so it does appear that the numbers of psychopaths is about the same numbers as the models show this mating strategy being effective before it breaks down. So I think that's kind of interesting, and there's not a lot of work really in this area of evolutionary psychology interpretations of psychopathy, but it is one that tends to make sense from those types of models, that these traits have evolved to to be non-conforming, to move, to not stick to any person, place, or thing or location, and that even when they have a good relationship going, and they are going to have a baby, they don't have any attachment, so they just move on. That's the model anyway.
Okay. Yeah, it's kind of scary. I was just reading an article that came out of Europe about people who put up advertisements that they will father children, artificial insemination. And you wonder if some of these people might be kind of following the model you presented. I'm not saying they are, but there might be some that might find that appealing, kind of in a narcissistic sort of way, to send the genes out or something.
I mean, I certainly, I think that if you were to ask psychopaths whether or not they could, freely give away their genetic material and get paid for it, they would all sign up.
Okay.
That's for sure.
Okay, so what are some of the aspects that you feel that individuals who feel that, well, this sounds like such a small number of people, why should I be concerned? Why should I read up on what a psychopath is? Yet people like, Robert Hare, they say that people should be very well informed. Why do you feel that maybe people should read your book and learn more about what goes into these individuals?
Well, I think that people are, I think that, like myself, people find it very intrinsically fascinating to study psychopaths because they just are so different from, the rest of us. It seems almost foreign or alien even to meet people who just are unable to appreciate, experience, or comprehend empathy, guilt and remorse. And I think from that perspective, it's an entertaining read of the personality, the profiles, the inmates, the discussions, and the meetings, and people will find it entertaining. From your own edification, perspective, I think that it's valuable, especially if you're single or you're starting off your careers and you want to be careful about how you interact with other people that you're going to meet, and et cetera, that arming yourself and understanding, some of these traits and how they can be potentially dangerous or how they can potentially, not lead to great successes. It's valuable to kind of understand, these traits and their potential, utility. And then I think that it's also interesting just because crime is such a big problem in the United States, and psychopathy in the world generally, of course, but in the United States in particular. We incarcerate more per capita than pretty much anybody in the world, that it's useful to think about, and one of the themes in the book is how we might, implement different types of strategies and or treatments that might help to reduce the chances that even high-risk individuals commit new crimes. and how, what kind of economic, impact that might have. I mean, the cost of crime in the United States is over $3 trillion a year, and that's more than we spend on all health care in the United States. And so wouldn't it be lovely if we could implement alternatives to some of our current thinking about treatment, about reducing violence and reoffending, reducing relapse to different drugs and other things? If we could develop and implement better evidence-based programs, then we might all save not only a lot of money, but reduce the cost of victims and future types of bad things, from happening. And so a lot of the book is written as a way of like, what is the state of the science? What is the state of the art? In this regard. And it's also a story about neuroscience. It's a story about how the science and the neuroscience that we have done to date has helped really understand how the brains of these individuals are different, how they get that way, and how we might be able to, even take a so-called broken or damaged or just, different brain and develop a way of helping to manage, the problems that these kids have or these adults have in such a way that it's better for everybody, but in particular for the kids.
Well, you brought up something interesting there I want to touch on. That is, do you think that if we had some sort of way of testing genetics or could put someone into an MRI, that we could identify certain individuals and maybe and use our resources differently with them at a young age than maybe, the one shoe fits all strategy that we seem to have used the last couple hundred years? Because it seems to be that if there is a genetic physiological difference or something in the limbic system, that we should be able to identify it easier in some people than others.
I think you have to recognize that, and we're becoming better at this, individualized, so to speak, medicine, in that, you can't treat everybody with the same, approaches. Like, for example, most of us learn from punishment, the fear of punishment, the fear of, going to prison or getting, arrested even, is enough to keep us from committing, antisocial, crimes or other types of things. And then there's a gradient of this, though, so that some people are super apprehensive, and then all the way down to the point where, some people are very much don't learn from punishment, don't learn from fear of or anticipation of those types of things happening. And for those individuals who don't learn from those things, well, you need to adopt something different. And so you need to develop procedures that work on other systems. So, for example, some of the ones that work well are reward-based programs. So instead of just straight punishing you for, failing your drug treatment program by testing hot for, some illegal drug, what we do is we reward you for every, clean urine test that you give every week. And we reward you with, like, movie tickets, and then we reward you with movie tickets plus a gas card, and then we reward you with movie tickets, a gas card, and, something else that you could, engages you to go work with your family. So maybe it's, a dinner out kind of thing, or some sort of participating restaurant donates a dinner. And when you learn that these positive things come from, not testing positive for those drugs, or these positive things happen, and eventually all the other things in your life, stabilize, families, job, etc., you realize that doing those drugs doesn't lead to any positive outcomes for you, and you look to the future, the long-term benefits rather than the short-term. And in psychology, we call this contingency management. And it just turns out that is a very effective way of reducing substance abuse for a large number of people. And implementing those types of programs is very cost-effective and has a high rate of success. So those are the types of principles I think we have to learn to adopt in society in order to try to minimize, understanding that people have individual differences, that's not like the rest of us. We just can't, you just can't take it for granted. You just can't. It's kind of liberal versus conservative. They each appeal to different. They each have different things that they're looking for, and they respond to different incentives and different motivations. And so we have to treat, individuals who end up in trouble with the same lens. And we have to look and see how we can identify programs that work for this population. We can't try to treat everyone the same because that's just not going to work. We know it's not going to work.
Right. So a person that has very limited guilt, feelings, if you want to use the Freudian term, super egos, if they have very, very limited guilt, then what you're proposing is, since people are motivated by pleasure, rather than pain in most cases, then ultimately a reward system could modify the behavior to where the person who does show higher levels of psychopathy will
Correct.
respond to society in more favorable ways.
Correct. It's not that dissimilar from, what's known as operant conditioning in the animal, behavior literature. So I use this example in my book, but I actually had a brief stint doing research and studying killer whales. And the last thing that you would think about when you're working with killer whales is that if they don't, perform the show trick at SeaWorld, that you're going to spank them. And they're going to learn from spanking the killer whale. Like, it just seems hilarious, right? But so the way they work on shaping their behavior is they use positive rewards, either fish or affection or, some freedom or some other types of positive rewards that the animal is intrinsically interested in. And then the animal's behavior can be shaped in such a way that, you don't have to try to use punishment to do that. And it's the same thing when you work with certain individuals who just don't learn from punishment, is that shaping their behavior using positive reward structures and incentives is much superior to changing their behavior. And if we're really, as a society, trying to help these people not come back to prison, which is very expensive, and help them to lead a semblance of a normal life, then the cost of giving these positive reinforcers is cheap, relative to the alternatives. And it's in the best interest of everyone to develop programs that work along these ways.
Okay. I've heard that there is some research that suggests that you can observe children as young as 5 and be able to determine who's going to wind up in trouble with the law and who isn't. Is that valid? And if so, what's the youngest that you would say a person should be examined for psychopathic tendencies?
Well, I think that's a great question. So the answer is yes, there are some data that would suggest in longitudinal studies that certain predictors, if your mother smoked cigarettes, if your mother was drinking alcohol while she was pregnant, that those things increase the risk that someone might, develop antisocial problems as an adult. However, these studies don't survey the entire space of everything. So it might be that, in some of those studies, it wasn't that the smoking per se or the alcohol per se was causing it, but that a general, poor maternal, investment in the children, so low socioeconomic, situation where mom's just not investing any, time or energy is what's predicting, the outcomes that you see. So there's a lot of science that's done, but you always have to think about, what they collected and what they didn't collect. So, for example, one thing that's common is low resting heart rate in children as a temperament variable, essentially measuring temperament, was related to future antisocial behavior at age 25. So kids who had low resting heart rate had an increased risk for developing antisocial behavior at age 25. But that same study didn't ask the question, well, was low resting heart rate predictive of whether or not they would be athletic, in the future? Or maybe it didn't predict, other types of outcomes that might relate to, different, positive things. So again, it's, there's a lot of studies that are looking at trying to understand and identify those risk factors that predict future antisocial behavior so we can try to curb it. And psychopathy, there are scales that have been developed, and there are people that are working, yes, as early as age 4, 5, and 6. Mostly what's been happening, though, is it's a recognition that the interpersonal and affective traits, so understanding how kids interact with other kids, how kids, respond to if they do something bad. Do they have any guilt, or do they have any, do they develop empathy? And recognizing that those are skills that can be developed, just like you can develop math and, English skills and other things, you can develop your emotional skills too. And if we work with kids who are having problems, that we might be able to develop those emotional skills in conjunction with the normal schooling to help make sure that they're interacting with groups better and they're not ending up getting in trouble and going down this path that might end up scoring high as adults. But unfortunately, we don't have good solid longitudinal data showing that traits that we might measure, in 6 years old today are going to be predictive of where someone's going to be on the psychopathic spectrum in 25 years. We just don't have, data that can actually, do that. So the studies that have been done are much shorter, just 3 or 4 or 5 years, and they generally show some decent stability, of these traits. But most of the kids in these studies are, 15, 16, 17, and how do they look when they're 19, 20, 21? And there's fairly strong continuity, especially at super high levels of the traits. And so that's just some of the, the latest science. But there's just a lot more that needs to be done before we would try to draw any conclusions about the stability of these things throughout the lifespan and the stability of assessing a child and then, what interventions would be there. But what we are very happy about in the field is that there is more and more recognition about the emotional affective traits, and just that those are traits that should be measured, should be understood, and should be treated or worked with or part of treatment therapy in order to help improve, and exercise them. Because I think that there is a lot of room to improve those functions.
Oh, excellent. Sounds very intriguing. We only have a couple minutes left here. Where can people find your book, and do you have a website people can go to and access information?
I do. So the book can be purchased on Amazon, I think, in any of the countries in which it's currently being sold, or it can be bought in Amazon USA and shipped. And of course, Barnes & Noble and the other major booksellers are all, carrying it. The website is the psychopathwhisperer.com, and I try to, use that website to highlight some of the best science in the field, to keep up to date with some of the newest things that are coming out. And that we tweet and do all sorts of things. So if a new paper comes out that shows something really interesting, then we try to, update our followers on, the newest science. So for example, a few weeks ago, a paper came out showing that, the more selfies you post, the higher you score on psychopathic traits. And that was kind of a fun, interesting thing. It's probably more about narcissism, and its relationship to, these traits than other things, but that was kind of a fun thing to talk about for a little bit. So we try to keep the readers up to date. And so I also have a personal website, which is a bit more academic, which is just kentkiehl.com. And there we try to cover, my speaking engagements and lectures and other types of things that, are more for academic, and legal and judicial crowds, in the arenas that I normally teach in.
All right. It sounds really, really interesting. Well, again, Professor Kiehl, thank you very much for being on the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
And I'd like to also thank the listening audience for tuning in, and hope to have you back next week for another episode of Unlock the Door Radio here on UCY TV Productions.
You've said there's 3 things that determine whether someone is a psychopath and someone can commit some of these kinds of horrible crimes. Brain pattern, genetic makeup, and childhood experience. 2 of those 3 are nature, not nurture. Are people born this way?
Well, people are born with a certain genetic makeup, and many are born with a certain propensity, sort of a brain pattern, a circuit that has low empathy, and it tends toward aggression. But by itself, that isn't enough to create a criminal, a killer. So we say that the